Good afternoon, everyone. We're thankful for you and thankful for your tuning in and being a part of these Bible studies that we've been putting out most every night of the week. If you've been paying attention, you know that our schedule has kind of been to put one of these out on Sunday night, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. And we live stream our worship on Sunday morning, and we live stream our Bible class on Wednesday night. So we're trying the best way we can to give you 6 days a week of devotionals or Bible studies that can help you and your family to stay focused on the most important things, even in the midst of this very trying and stressful time. Before we get into our study today, just want to remind you that we are trying to put something together for our community and for our church family. If you wouldn't mind to share those photos that have you and your family worshiping together, we would be greatly appreciative of that. And as we've been doing, we'll start with our 3rd through 6th graders. Parents, it might be a good idea for you to go through these questions as well, just sort of mentally, and see if you can remember the answers to these questions, and then help those 3rd through 6th graders as they go back through Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 15, looking for these answers. Number 1 tonight, how many satraps did Darius set over the kingdom? Again, Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Number 2, what did the king plan for Daniel? Said that there was something specific that he was looking at Daniel to do. And what was that plan? Number 3, how long was the injunction supposed to last? That these men came to Darius and wanted him to propose or to put out an injunction. How long was that supposed to last? And then, why did Daniel have his windows open? We discussed at the end of our time last night, we discussed this idea of Daniel does sort of disobey the thing that had been put out, but we very quickly made sure that everyone understands that he did so from the privacy of his own home. He did so because he was being asked to defile his belief and defile his faith, and he was certainly not going to do that. But in the midst of that, we said that he had his windows open, and he had those open for a very specific purpose. So what was that purpose? All right, now we're going to get into Daniel chapter 6. This is the second part of Daniel chapter 6, and probably the more well-known portion of this particular chapter, because it does have to deal with the story or the account that many of us remember even from our childhood about Daniel in the lion's den. So if you remember where we were discussing the fact that Darius had sorrowfully had worked tirelessly, but sorrowfully had to admit that there was no other recourse but for Daniel to have to go into the lion's den, because his decree, based on their law in that day, the Medes and Persians, it could not be broken, it could not be taken back. So, because of that, verse 16 we pick up there with the king, Darius, telling Daniel, unfortunately, you're going to have to go into the den of lions, and he declared that, may your God whom you serve continually deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Let's take just a moment in this very first little part of this second section of chapter 6, and let's point out 2 things. First and foremost, look at the testimony of one who was really an outsider. Darius, he says, may your God whom you serve continually deliver you. It's amazing to think that someone like Darius, who had no real connection to the one true God, because that's just not how he had been raised and not how he had been taught, and unfortunately he had not come to know God as we hope so many people during this time of stress will come to know God and know who he is. Darius had not taken advantage of those opportunities that had been placed in front of him, and we know how good of an example Daniel was. So there's a lot of lessons kind of wrapped up in these moments with Daniel, and one is there are times where your example matters so much that it might literally be the only Bible that a person reads. Now, in this case, we know that they did not have the complete Bible as we understand it personally today in 2020, but Daniel served as Scripture in his physical acts, in his speech, in the way that he treated people. He served as a physical, living example, a living sacrifice, as Paul would say later in Romans chapter 12, a literal living sacrifice, a living example for Darius to understand that, man, there's something about Daniel that's just different, and it has to be of a divine nature. That's the way that these men looked at Daniel. Is his connection to God was so strong that they could see it in his actions and in the way that he handled himself and the way that he spoke. So that's the first thing I want you to notice, is the testimony of an outsider. Secondarily, I want you to notice that he commits fully. Darius understands that in his kingdom and in the rule that he is going to try to place over those that he is now in charge of, to Darius, the thing that mattered the most was maintaining that level of power. And so even though it's the wrong thing to do, Darius still seals that stone that is put on the mouth of the den of the lions, that nothing could be changed. And isn't it sad that sometimes, unfortunately, out in the world, and even sometimes sadly even in the church, we see people who choose things of this world to matter more than doing the right thing. And it is heartbreaking, it's sad, but it does take place. And we see that here in Darius. Darius choosing to make his power and his standing as the king more important than doing what was right. And then verse 18, one other thing to notice from this very first introductory section of this second part of Daniel chapter 6 is that the king went to his palace, and he was so disturbed by his choice and by what he had done to Daniel that he literally could not sleep, and his attention could not be taken off of this choice that he had made. It bothered him all night. He did not eat. He did not sleep. We say that, we throw that around a lot. We say things like, I didn't eat or sleep because of what happened. And sometimes that's true. For some people, they legitimately didn't do those things. But for a lot of times, we say those things as sort of almost an exaggeration at times. We say, well, that right there would keep me up all night. And in reality, it probably wouldn't. Well, that right there, that would cause me, I wouldn't want to eat for days. And the truth is, it really wouldn't happen that way. But we all have been through times where something has happened to us, or we've made such a poor choice about things, or we've done something, or we've said something, that eating and sleeping just take a back seat because we realize the wrong that we've done. And that's where Darius finds himself. He realizes, even though he's not a godly man, he realizes what he's done is wrong. It's morally wrong. He has just put a man in the den of lions who truthfully did not belong there. And it bothered him to no end. Now, at the break of day, this part of the account, the king arose and he went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. Look at that word there, anguish. That is more than just being sad. That's more than just sort of maybe having a tear in your eye. Anguish is, it feels like your body is being ripped apart because of the grief and the despair that you feel. And that's how Darius felt when he got there. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of," now watch how he changes tone here, "servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" The reason why I bring that up is because if we back up just for a moment, when he sent Daniel in, his statement was, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Now as he comes back the following morning, he declares God to be the living God. Now, let's understand that he's making a separation between the living God, the one true God, Yahweh, Jehovah God. He's making a separation between God and all these small g, little g gods that have been discussed by Belshazzar and even Nebuchadnezzar and others before him. Darius probably raised in a situation where they bowed down and worshipped idols. They bowed down and worshipped pieces of metal or pieces of wood even. And here's what the separation that Darius makes is there is a group of gods that are not living. In Daniel, you serve one who is living. So there is something to be taken here. And again, the testimony of an outsider takes another step. Now he calls him the living God. Daniel answers the king, verse 21, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, first and foremost, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Now, if you notice there, Daniel, and I sort of tried to emphasize that as we went into the verse, Daniel makes sure that Darius and anyone else who's listening knows that to be found blameless before God is the most important thing. Now, if Darius, for whatever reason, or anyone else for that matter, wants to hold a grudge against Daniel, well, the truth is that's their choice. But he even makes sure that they understand, I didn't do anything wrong to you either, king. Now let's look at that from a practical standpoint, and let's look very briefly at what that looks like in real time, in real life. A lot of times people walk around with grudges that they're holding. They're still angry at somebody because of something they said or something they did years ago, months ago. And they say, well, I'm not going to say anything to them, but man, I'm going to tell you what, I'll never look at them the same way again. And here's what you and I need to understand is when that person goes to God and asks for forgiveness, then truthfully, we should be welcoming of that. We should encourage that. We shouldn't discourage them from being forgiven by God. That's the most important thing. Now, if there is enmity between myself and someone else, or if there is an issue between the two of us, then certainly we want to try our best to work that out. But the most important thing for any of us is to be found blameless before God. And that's what Daniel says here. Now, he does, again, go on to say, and I haven't done anything even to you in a human-to-human sense. This makes Darius exceedingly glad, verse 23, and he commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Now, this should sound very familiar. It should sound a lot like the end of Daniel chapter 3, when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are brought out of that fiery furnace. And the men there, and even Nebuchadnezzar himself, basically take a sniff of these men and don't even smell smoke on them. Even though they've been in this horrific inferno, there's no sign of fire on them. They're not burned in any way. There's no smell of smoke on them. There's nothing. There's no evidence that they had even been in a fiery furnace. And Daniel's the same way. When they pull Daniel up out of this den, there's not even a scratch on him from being pushed into this den. Nothing wrong with him. And in both cases, Daniel 3 and Daniel 6, it is revealed by the author that that's because of their trust in God. Ultimately, it's because they trusted God. So, the king, verse 24, commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused. Now, understand that word as well. There's very important to understand word placement and word meanings. A lot of times it adds to the character or the texture of what you're reading. And in this case, it certainly does. These men didn't accuse Daniel sort of innocently. They didn't do so ignorantly, as though maybe, well, we thought we saw Daniel doing something bad, and we turned him in, and it turns out he wasn't doing anything bad. No, the Bible makes sure that we all understand that these men maliciously, which means with harm on their minds, with harm on their breath, they accused Daniel with the intent of destroying him. And because of that, look at what happens to them. Daniel is out of the den now, not a scratch on him. The king now turns, Darius does, and he has these men cast into the den of lions, and not just them, their children and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. It truly is, it's hard to read that. It's difficult for us. But you, again, understand you're listening to the events where someone who is an outsider, someone who is not connected to God in the sense of being a follower of God, is doing what he felt was right and just in that moment. And as much as it pains us to read that, and it hurts us because we don't like to read that there were these men and their children and their wives thrown into this den and these lions destroyed them, that should be the heartbreak we feel when we're around those that we know are wandering off into a situation where they're lost. If you were standing there that day, would you have said something? Would you have tried to convince Darius perhaps not to put those men and those children and those women into the den? I don't know. I don't know if I would have or if I wouldn't have, but what I do know is I have the opportunity right now in these times of stress and these times of anxiety. There's opportunity even now For me to reach out to those that I know are lost and say, before it becomes too late, would you please listen to what the Bible has to say? And that's what we want to take. That's the lesson we want to pull from this, is that while we have the opportunity, let's try our absolute best to keep people from destruction. The end of the matter here in Daniel chapter 6 is wrapped up this way. Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. Now, how about that? From a warrior king, he begins a letter to everyone who's going to read this. This isn't just to his people. This is to everyone he knows, everyone he can get contact to. This warrior king begins with, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. Now look at what he adds this time. Enduring forever, his kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. Now that would be enough. How about that for a testimony concerning God? He is the living God. That's what he added the last time when he had spoken to Daniel on that morning when he was trying to see if Daniel was okay. He added the phrase, the living God. Now look at what pours out of the mouth of this outsider. That God is enduring forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion will be to the end. And then he adds to it, verse 27, these beautiful thoughts. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. And so the end of Daniel chapter 6 gives us this note. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Two things very quickly as we wrap up. Number one, the testimony of an outsider. We mentioned it multiple times throughout our study today. It's amazing that even someone like Darius, who isn't, again, not known for being a Christian, not known for being a follower of God, not known for being in any way connected to the law of God, he sees a faith like Daniel's, and it draws out of him these words and these statements of praise to God. I'm reminded of in Luke chapter 19, when Jesus is going into the city, he's told by some of the Pharisees that he needs to quiet down his followers. They're being too loud. They're making too much racket. They're being obnoxious. They're being over the top, and they demand that Jesus quiet them down. And here's what Jesus has to say. Their statement is, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." This is Luke chapter 19, verse 39 and 40. And Jesus answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, then the very stones would cry out." I'm reminded of that because you look at this situation, and Daniel is sort of put in a position where he can't do much of the speaking and teaching that he had probably been doing when given the opportunity. You see, at this point, Daniel is down in the lion's den, and it's impossible for him to do some of the teaching, and yet even then, because of what he had seen, Darius calls God the living God, which is absolutely true. And then once Daniel comes out of the den and he's able to speak to Darius, and Darius is able to see a physical manifestation of the glory of God through his saving of Daniel and the faith of Daniel, the words can't stop coming. They just keep flowing about him being a rescuer, about him saving Daniel, and about him having a kingdom that will never be destroyed and dominion that will not end. Those words just come flowing out of the mouth of an outsider. It's amazing to think about, and it's very encouraging to know that our example can have that type of influence even today if we will maintain and continue to live as God would have us to live. But then the second point, and this is where we kind of get into a quick challenge to end our time, is faith in God brings prosperity. If I didn't put the word real in there, there'd probably be some people that would have issue with that statement, because there's been so much damage done by those who preach a prosperity gospel or a name it and claim it type gospel. And unfortunately, there's many false teachers out there who are standing up in front of crowds, especially right now in a time of turmoil in our country. And they're trying to tell people that if you will invest X number of dollars, then God's going to bless you. And if you don't, well, there's something wrong with you. And if things are going good for you, that's because God likes you. And if things are going bad for you, that must be because you're not doing enough and you need to do more. Well, here's why I put the word real there. If you look at Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11, it's an oft-used verse, but it's important to remember. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for good, plans for welfare, plans for peace, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. You see, faith in God does bring prosperity, but it brings real prosperity, which is peace. It brings future. It brings a future, and it brings hope. You see, those who have faith in God, those who do as God commands, those who obey God, are certainly going to be prosperous. Because you see, they're going to live in peace. They're going to live in hope. And they know of their future. And what a beautiful picture that paints. The testimony of an outsider. It's amazing to read Darius's words at the end of the chapter. But don't take away from the influence and the impact of Daniel. And you see there in that last verse, that final verse, verse 28, that Daniel prospered under these kings, these outsiders. Why? Why? When he doesn't have any connection to the country where he's living or the people that are in charge. How in the world could you say Daniel is prospering? Well, it's very simple. It's because of his faith in God. And may we have the same type of faith each and every day of our lives.